Good evening. Welcome to Conversations with Charlie Lutes. I want to start with Charlie, kind of right off. Our topic today is modes of the mind. And the topic of the mind is always a fascinating one because there's so much we can talk about. What is the mind? Is the mind me, or is it something I have?
Well, you might say the mind, actually, as we understand the mind, is a condensation and an individualization. Let's just say the individual mind is a condensation and individualization of the higher mind. It's the mind, actually, that weighs and evaluates everything, passes judgment on all things, and usually, from a standpoint of not being too well informed, and it's the mind, you might say the workaday mind, the mind that certainly that we gain knowledge with, and the mind that when we're children has great acceptability, but as we mature has less and less receptivity or acceptability and becomes more and more negative. And you might say, well, the negativity to a certain degree or a certain extent is simply self-preservation, but that's only a small part of it. Beyond that, we just have a negative outlook, almost everything in life. And the individual mind, of course, there are all levels and all degrees, you might say, of development of the mind. Some much more higher developed, certainly, than others, and some have very little development. But oddly enough, the mind with the less development is the most dogmatic mind, and the mind that has practically all the answers except one, which is the right answer. And as you become more and more mindful, so to speak, or higher development of mind, then you begin to realize there's something beyond what I know. There's something here that I'm not aware of. It's just like creativity. Creativity actually is a part of the higher mind, not the lower mind. And after a while, when we begin to think in terms that there must be something beyond what I know, there must be a higher point here that I haven't reached, then certainly you realize or you discover that you have to go within yourself.
That point of recognition, you've brought that up on other shows, and it's a topic I'd like to go into a little bit more. What causes that? What leads a person to suddenly think that perhaps the dogmas that I've held on to don't have all the answers? Maybe I don't have all the answers. What spurs a person to make that decision? What can be done?
Because there's no inner fulfillment in life. You actually, even though you're miserable, in many cases, you think you're happy. Then you begin to realize, I guess I am miserable. There's something here. There's something beyond what I know. There's something here far more than I have at this point realized. And that's the point of realization right there. Now that's a point of inner recognition. And at that point, actually, this is the point where you might say you become a seeker. Seeker of what? Seeker of yourself. Who am I? You start asking the question, who am I? Well, I'm not this, I'm not that, but I am something. Something more, certainly, than I've ever equated myself to be. Therefore, at that juncture, you begin to search and seek, and you find that you have to go within yourself. And going within yourself, then you begin at that point and that juncture to unfold a tremendous latent potential. Now you're bringing into fruition, you might say, or into daily life, that aspect of the higher mind.
How far does one go in? What does one find? In other words, there are a group...
Well, to go in actually means that you have to transcend yourself.
All the way?
You have to transcend the whole field, really, the whole field of relativity. When you transcend the field of relativity, then, of course, you come in contact with the essence of mind itself.
That's something very intimate then. Some people say you have to just learn how to make up your mind. Others, you have to get in touch with your feelings. But you're saying we have to go even beyond that.
Well, to make up your mind is to make up your mind actually on the basis of what you know. And unfortunately, most people, as an example, reason from a conclusion and not to a conclusion. You should reason to a conclusion. They don't do that. They reason from an immediate conclusion, and they reason from that. And even so, in passing judgment on everything and everybody, they do that just simply from what they know. That's why I say it's mostly from a platform of ignorance, rather than from a platform of really knowing. Because when you really know, you don't pass judgment on anything or anybody. Because now it's the higher mind beginning to reflect. And when the higher mind begins to reflect, that's the so-called universal mind, totality of mind, the mind itself, really. Now this begins to reflect, and you begin to reflect this in your nature, then you change very radically. You come into what you might call quiet acceptances of life.
How does that, when a person has that quiet acceptance of life and begins to raise their consciousness and enjoy life, how does that fit with the observation that we have now, let's say, that there are things that are wrong with the world?
Well, unfortunately, we're busy always trying to change things that we can't change, and not changing the very thing that we really are able to change, and that's ourselves. If we were to change ourselves, if everyone was to change themselves, then the whole world would change. Everything would change. There'd be a whole new understanding. You wouldn't be constantly fighting the windmills of life. You'd be dealing with that which was realistic, and that not with that which is not realistic. So actually, when you do begin to understand, and you do begin to realize, you realize there are certain things you cannot change. I might have a hard time trying to change you, because everybody's locked into a level of consciousness, and unfortunately I can't unlock you. You can't unlock me.
That's right. You've been telling me the same thing, but I keep asking the same question.
You unlock yourself. But you have to unlock yourself at a point of recognition, and when you recognize this, then is when you come into inner realization. This is what transcendental meditation unfolds. The fact that there is a tremendous inner latent potential that you're able to draw upon. And if you begin to draw upon this, certainly you begin to reflect this. And if you begin to reflect this, then you're an entirely different person.
So it isn't that you, by having a quiet acceptance of life, it isn't that you stop caring for the world. There's still compassion and interchange with the world?
Oh, certainly. You're in the world. As long as you're in the world, you're going to be of the world. But it's not so much in the world or of the world, it's more what you're identifying with. And then you begin to realize, yes, changes can be affected, certainly. But the first change that has to be affected is the change within myself. This is the important change. Then I'll no longer jump to a conclusion. I'll reason to a conclusion. And not only that, my reasoning will be far more valid. It'll be far deeper, have a much wider perspective than it's ever had. Because you're drawing upon greater and greater mind.
The mind grows from childhood. You said there's a certain kind of mind that we grow.
Childlike mind.
And then we have an adult-like mind.
Yes.
And then at some point we have to develop the higher mind. Will that develop naturally, or do we have to take some action, turning within, as you put it?
No, in the course of life, certainly as we become mature, we should think in a more mature way. Some never do, but generally speaking, yes, this is the pattern of life. We do come into maturity, and as I say, when the mind matures, it becomes much less receptive. Show me becomes more the attitude.
Is that a loss?
Acceptability.
Do we lose something? They often say that the child has so much that we lose as we grow up. Is it natural to lose these things?
Really, the way we reflect and the way we are and our attitudes toward things is more because of subconscious pressures. Whatever these subconscious pressures are, then these reflect in our outer everyday life. Some people are very suspicious of everything and everybody. Some people very negative about all things. Some negative about some things, not about others. Some people very happy, some very unhappy. All these different things. Generally speaking, they're mostly the result of inner pressures or subconscious pressures.
How are they alleviated, or what can we do about those?
Well, purification, really. Embark upon a process of purification of the body, purification of the mind. All these pressures then dissolve or resolve, whichever the case may be.
The mind, is the mind something? Does it have weight or substance or reality to it, or is it just something that is it like light in a candle?
Well, the brain has weight, the brain has substance, but the brain, you might say, is just simply the mechanism for the mind to function through. The mind is a universal consideration, really. You can't put weight to it, you can't put anything to it except what it really is, totality. Totality of existence itself is really mind.
So the process is taking the reflection of it, you call it the individual mind.
Well, the condensation of it, or individualization of it. See, the universal mind and the individual mind is just simply relative. except that the universal mind has been just condensed down to such very fine confines, you might say, that in this individualization it knows very little. But it has to come into a wider and wider awareness.
How wide can it go?
Oh, till its totality.
What's the range of human potential as far as the mind?
Well, as far as the mind is concerned, the totality of mind would be the ability to know all there is to know about all things simultaneously. Now, the human does have the ability to know all there is to know about any one subject, any one time. That's his limitation in the human body. But you're asking the potential of universal mind is to know all things. And not only to know all things, but to know all things simultaneously, plus the ability to know all there is to know about creation simultaneously.
Would that mean that anyone that would...
You know the scriptures say, and he knows of the fall of the smallest sparrow.
Yeah.
Certainly, that's all it's saying, that there is nothing that isn't known and known simultaneously.
Would that mean that anyone that would take advantage of this process and develop their mind fully would be a genius?
Ultimately, but not only that, he would be a well-balanced genius. He'd be a genius in all fields. Usually when we consider a genius, they have abilities in certain departments, certain lines, but not in all things. I've known a few geniuses that in some departments they weren't even home, but in other departments nobody else understood them. They were so far out there. But to become well-balanced, now another thing too in life is to obtain balance in life, equilibrium in life, to become balanced in all things. What good is it if you're a genius in one department and totally emotionally immature in another department, you see? And this does happen.
So development is not just an intellectual thing, then?
Development is not an intellectual thing. Intellectually we do develop, certainly. But there's more than that, much more than that. There's a tremendous, as I said, untapped inner potential that we're able to draw upon.
Let's draw upon this. We'll take a break first.
Okay.
I hope you don't mind. We'll be back with the mind.
All right.
Enlightenment in terms of all this. Now, there's a lot of talk about an age of enlightenment and people gaining enlightenment. Is this a mode of the mind, or how does this relate to the mind?
Enlightenment is beginning to use, or not beginning, but using your potential. Utilizing your own potential. Reflecting your own potential in daily life. What it amounts to as far as the human is concerned is moving more and more toward the light. And as you move more and more toward the light, you find out not only are you enlightened, but ultimately you discover you are the light. That's the great difference. That is enlightenment.
It seems so simple when you say that we are the light. There's
well, everything is simple to say, you know.
That's right. That was my question. If it's right here, and it's just us, why do so many of us miss it? And why have so many ages spent so long suffering and being in difficulties when this potential is available to us?
Well, for one thing, it's not offered on a daily basis throughout all of creation. It appears in various times, in various segments of, you might say, human life. Now happens to be the particular time. We're phasing into a new age, as you well know, age of enlightenment, as we call it. Others may call it the Aquarian age, others may call it the nuclear age, atomic age, or whatever you want to call it. But in any case, we are coming to a new age. An age where there will be a tremendous unfoldment of the mind, because we do not lock ourselves in to limitations or into preconceived concepts. That's the important thing. For instance, 1492, the great concept was the earth was flat. If you went out far enough, you had to drop off. The reality, I mean, that might have been the reality of the day, certainly, but the actuality was it was round. And we come into a greater awareness, is what it really amounts to. And we begin to understand with greater depth. And the more you understand, the you realize the less you. And this is a very thing. It's really unlocking the mind. Now, again, as I said, there are a myriad levels of consciousness. And unless you have some means, some method of unfolding this, unlocking this consciousness. You just put it, now you can be educated, you can be educated. Yes, that's knowledge. Knowledge is not wisdom. Now knowledge is what you know about anything of an external nature. But the main problem is that we as human beings have been almost totally externalized, and we've accepted everything to be external, which is on the platform of knowledge. And that's only, as you probably well know, the tip of the iceberg. What we begin to find out is that when we begin to internalize ourselves, then we come into that tremendous well of knowledge. And we begin to unfold this. As I said, knowledge is what you know. Wisdom is what you know about yourself. Everything in creation has its opposite, except wisdom. And wisdom is the one thing that stands alone. It stands by itself. It has no opposite. Because it's all, it's totality. And then, as we begin to go within and fathom our own interior, as we begin to fuse intelligence, awareness, consciousness, creativity, which is the higher mind, into our daily life, then we begin to reflect this. And it's an entirely different situation. That's the whole crux of the thing, really.
So it's a matter of a person making a conscious decision to unfold this, then?
At some point, sometime, as I have said before, there comes a time when you begin to realize there's something beyond what I know. There's something that I have not even tapped the surface of. At that point, at that juncture, then you begin to, what is this? And then you discover that it's going within you. As I said, at this point you become a seeker. Not all seek the same way, not all find the same answer, certainly not. Ultimately, yes, but not in the beginning. So you begin to seek, you begin to search. And what you discover is, as I've said several times here in the last few minutes, you have to go within yourself.
That before one gains this assurance on their own self that they have to become we sometimes resist that which is good for us. And, people often say, I know I shouldn't do it, but I like it. I don't want to change. Why do we tend to resist what holds us back just growing into this potential?
Well, for one thing, negativity of the mind, and said before, reluctance. Accept anything. Senses. If you can't taste it, touch it, feel it, see it, hear it, it doesn't exist. You see? So we put all of our values in that. And we haven't any awareness that there's something so much greater beyond this. When we begin to realize, as I said again, we begin to realize this. The senses are totally external. The mind is externalized. The mind, does not have the ability to go within itself, fathom its own interior nature. It can only do it by a very defined process, a la transcendental meditation, which is certainly what I use.
It's not something we stumble into.
No, it's not something that you just stumble into. It's a very, very defined process of doing.
Although we can have those flashes of insight. In other words, very often artists would say that this particular painting, the inspiration was just something that wasn't from them. It just kind of flowed through. It wasn't something they had to consciously work out. People, when they write, let's say, composers, they seem to have almost
that's being creative
contact with mind or intuitive.
Sure, because with the creative mind has the ability to reach out and to come at that which is greater than what you normally will. But both things are true. There are great artists, and certainly they can paint scenes that they see on here, which are tremendously, they're very beautiful. But on the other hand, too, they create something that doesn't even exist, as far as we know here. But it does exist, but it's in a very much more subtle field. It's in a subtler aspect of creativity, because the creative mind is a more subtle mind. And a subtle mind means a mind more inner development. That's the important thing.
What's the relationship between the higher mode of the mind and higher states of consciousness? She talks about transcendental consciousness, cosmic consciousness, unity consciousness.
Those are degrees of consciousness. As I said before, there are myriad levels of consciousness. But now when you come into an absolute status where the mind functions from, you might say, a cosmic level, which is a universal level. Now the mind is beginning to function from a universal totality, beginning to function from the totality of mind, or from the aspect of mind that knows no limitations. That which is all existing, all enduring, that is not temporal. And we begin just from that level. But again, there are degrees of refinement even there. This is what degrees of refinement, greater affinity.
As a person grows, they become a seeker, they're starting to become a finder. Is it a smooth path? Just straight on, or is it still ups and downs?
Well, because of the nature of life itself and because of the vicissitudes of life and the ups and downs and the ins and outs and the problems and so forth, it's not all that smooth, but it's a great deal smoother than it was before. And eventually and ultimately, after a given time, it does smooth out, yes, and becomes very, very smooth. But oftentimes in the beginning, see, we have great things within ourselves, great pressures and problems that have compounded themselves and manifest in our inner mind, negative minds, you might say, in our subconscious mind. And all of these are constantly nagging at us, and we have to resolve a great amount of this. Or dissolve it, resolve and dissolve, same thing. And in the process of gaining higher acceptability or higher mind concept, you this process. But you have to do that in order to rid yourself of all that. This is why you come to quiet acceptances. This is why you come into realization far beyond anything you ever dreamed that there was before. Now, when you come into a problem, life is just that, situation after situation, condition after condition, problem upon problem. Now, you have an immediate means and method and a greater reserve, a greater strength, a well, you might say, of durability that you never before to solve anything with. Much simpler to solve, much easier to solve. Because you have greater insight to your own self. You have a greater awareness of your. This is why I said, know thyself. If you were to know yourself, you'd know all there was about the whole universe.
Something that everyone will be able to take advantage of, these kind of things. You hear about a few people down, through the ages, this guy and somebody else has
limited anyone. There's no limitation, certainly not. I'd say maybe one limitation, that is, it works with human beings.
I can't teach my dad to do it.
Well, he might have a problem. But I'll tell you, if you become smarter, your dog will become smarter. If you become a better person, your dog will become a better person.
The mailman will like that.
Oh, the mailman, yes, he'll be happy about that.
So in other words, it's something, when we say age of enlightenment, it just seems so
Age of enlightenment means that the means and the method will be much easier to find, much easier to acquire than it ever was before. Plus the fact in the age of enlightenment, everything in that age is made much easier, much clearer. This is why the age has been referred to in many quarters, you might say, as the age of heaven on earth. Heaven's just for happiness. When there will be happiness on earth. Now, if people functioned in a very constructive way instead of a destructive way, if they functioned in a positive way instead of continuing in a negative way, don't you think that would create great happiness? The whole world would reflect this. And it's what we're coming into. Because we're coming into pure awareness, what we're really talking about.
But it's not just a few people in some mountain somewhere, it's going to be
many. Oh, goodness, no. Worldwide. Worldwide. The whole world will come into it. And this is what's really beginning to happen now. Otherwise, you wouldn't have an age of enlightenment. You'd have a little enlightenment place and dark everywhere else.
I know things are moving very quickly. I mean, it saw the first airplane take off, and they also saw men landing on the moon. But I wanted to know how far.
They talked over the first telephone and a few things.
A lot of things, yeah. Is the age of enlightenment around the corner? Is it far down?
It's not around the corner. It's here right now. But again, it's all fold on you like a giant explosion. It simply comes into, but it's coming very rapidly. It's already here. It's here right now. But there will be more and more manifestation of it.
There's still wars happening here and there, but it's less if we look at the papers.
Less and less. And people are beginning to realize that war is a means of arbitration. I think as General MacArthur said, has certainly outmoded itself. We better come to which is reasonable now. In other words, as I've said before, we'll have peace or we'll have pieces. One way or the other.
We have our choice then.
You have choice, yes. And I think everybody wants peace, really. Everybody will be happy. That's the innate nature of life itself, happiness. The only thing is people haven't known how to do it, that's all. And now they do know that if you go within yourself, you find happiness. Because that's your nature. Your inner nature is that bliss, which is maximum as far as happiness is concerned.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. You've made us all very much more happy, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you next week.
Right.